And we're back, and we're finally going to cover On Human Nature by Walter Scruton with Bulgakov's Behemoth. Boats, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Just smoking while it's raining outside, which is
Beautiful.
always, very beautiful, very good. Drinking some wine.
You're drinking wine, you're smoking, it's raining outside, we're talking philosophy. Are you a Frenchman or are you not?
Well, I'm very Mediterranean, I'll put it that much. Southern French, we'll say that.
We went live back. We're not live. We started recording because we were having a great conversation beforehand. And I was kind of like, we should probably hit record on this one,
Yep.
So actually talk about this. We were talking about this is a book from Walter Scruton. This is actually the first time covering Scruton on a podcast. So that's going to be hopefully this goes well, and I think I can kind of grasp some Scruton stuff here, and it's an enjoyable conversation.
We've done him indirectly. Yeah, we've done him indirectly before because I wrote an article on one of his books summarizing a few points that I thought were very important to grasp, which were not necessarily Thomistic or scholastic or even Catholic points, but which certainly share a lot of correlation and I think are mostly correct in their intuition and where they're aiming at.
Yeah. I guess this is I think I've finished 2 Scruton books at the same time. I was On Human Nature and Soul of the Word, and both times I was reading a phaser book. It was either Philosophy of the Mind or The Last Superstition. And I gotta say that there's a weird a complementary nature to both those books, which you read. Like, so if you read Soul of the Word with Philosophy of Mind, or if you read Human Nature with Last Superstition. There's a weird like phaser and Scruton complement each other in a nice way. I think phaser is correct more often, but Scruton is a lot more beautiful in his way he writes, I guess.
Yeah.
Would you say he's a Kantian, or would you say he's not really a Kantian?
He's not a Kantian, but he does say, he has said this explicitly, I forget in which book or which lecture, that he has explicitly said that his 2 biggest influences are Kant and Wittgenstein. Maybe it wasn't sexual desire, I forget, but he's very explicit that his 2 main influences are Kant and Wittgenstein.
Now, he referenced Wittgenstein a few times in this book, and I got to say, I know nothing about Wittgenstein besides that's his name. He's not someone who pops up in our circles often enough. Would you know anything about Wittgenstein?
Yeah, I know a bit. I haven't read Wittgenstein directly. I've read a lot of Scruton summarizing Wittgenstein over the years. That's mostly my interaction with Wittgenstein. I've read some Anscombe, some Elizabeth Anscombe, and she was kind of his editor at the end of his life, as well as his star pupil and a Catholic philosopher, by the way. So you can read her and get a lot of Wittgenstein, but with more Catholic, I suppose. And so I know some Wittgenstein, not very much. What I really know from him is the private language argument, which he employs in this book in a very truncated form. But it's very interesting stuff. He's mostly a linguistic analyst, is most what he's really famous for.
I got to say, this book is definitely one that was I could be mistaken by saying this is the first strictly philosophical book I've covered on the podcast. We've done political ones, we've done history ones, we've done Zuck Martin's Pre-Reformers is more of a, I don't know if I would call it strict philosophy or history, but this seems much more like a closer to a strict philosophy book to cover on the podcast. So it's gonna be a fun conversation.
Yes, indeed. It's very much philosophical anthropology is what this book is. Last Superstition has bits of it. Philosophy of Mind is a bit of philosophical anthropology. But this doesn't really just talk about philosophy of mind. It has other interests as well. But philosophy of mind features indirectly in it. It features indirectly in the IU encounter, which you asked me in DMs to explain in this recording.
Yes, so, when we get to the IU encounter, I will have you explain that, because that's something there were very few points in school and make that I would think I would disagree with. There were a few that he made that I'm I think I disagree there. But a lot of his points I'm kind of just trying to understand, because it's very outside my, when I read philosophy. Yes, it's outside. It's not the language I speak. When I read philosophy, I'm always reading Catholic or Thomist stuff, and so this is very just kind of okay. I think I get what he's saying. I'm not positive. I tried to finish the introduction to the Kant book he wrote, and then I couldn't get through that one because the moment I heard Kant, he said Kant described marriage as a legal contract entailing the use of the other person's sexual organs. I'm like, I'm out. I'm done. I'm not going past this one.
That might have actually been an example of him saying where Kant was like, "That's so stupid." Might have been an example of him like saying, like, "Look, he made mistakes too."
Yeah. It's just like a very materialist, autistic kind of way of describing marriage.
Yeah, it's a very contractualist approach to human relations, which is very funny.
Which is something school and talks about in this book. It's kind of like he in the last chapter. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but it's fine. He describes the different the individualist and the communitarian, and talking about morality, the contractualist and the utilitarian.
Yes.
And I mean, contractualist and morality. I'm just thinking of both of us came from the anarchist circles.
Mm-hmm.
All I could think of is how many times I remember. I mean, personally making arguments kind of in a consent-based contractual ethic.
Yes, we're very familiar with that sort of thinking. Utilitarianism, versus anarchist utilitarian, someone like David Friedman would be an example of an anarchist utilitarian. There's others, I'm sure, but so that's a little bit more familiar to, I suspect, both of us, at least. Yeah, I suspect it's familiar to both of us and those who have dabbled in those circles or other circles as well.
Now, he brought up the categorical imperative. I know it's not super crucial to the conversation we're going to be having tonight, but do you know exactly what the categorical imperative is? And if so, can you explain it to the audience?
I can certainly try. So off the top of my head, the categorical imperative is basically, how to put this? It's not a hypothetical imperative. So a hypothetical imperative would be something like, if you're thirsty, drink water. So there's an if there. There's a condition that must be first met before this task can be undertaken. But if you say you should never murder someone, there's no if. There's just you should never murder someone. And so the categorical imperative is an imperative of this type. Now, what Kant is trying to do is to justify such a rule and explicitly base his morality on such a rule. Now, he, if I remember correctly, from my very brief readings of Kant, would be something like, this imperative is something that reason itself, and us being reasonable beings, that is, beings which possess reason, or I'm not sure possess reason would be the word to use, but I'll use that for the sake of argument, that possess reason would be urged to comply with. And I forget the exact details of his argument, but he essentially makes the idea that if you want to see if something works as a universal law, then you must first see, and the universal law would be a categorical imperative such as never murder someone, would be try to see if everyone can follow it. You must will that everyone follows this rule. If this rule is not followable by everyone, or if a society descends into anarchy and bad things happen, then you should not will that this rule be followed. So everyone should murder someone clearly cannot attain to the status of a categorical imperative, according to Kant. Phaser, in the last precision, raises several objections to this sort of ethic. I forget which. I can try and find them later if you really want. But it's certainly an interesting perspective, and you can sort of see anarchist roots taking place there in the sense of a contractualist approach of non-aggression. You can sort of see the non-aggression principle as a kind of an extension of the categorical imperative. In that sense, it is a rule that reason impels us to follow, that is followable by everyone, and therefore ought to be followed by everyone because it guarantees a stable, secure, safe society, according to anarchists. Now, you may say, well, you first have to define society. Why is that good? And then you can bring in what is the final causality of a common polity. Is it to just be safe? Is it to be better? What is better? Then you have to bring in the final causality of man. So there's objections you can make to this, and of course Kant's argument is more intricate than what I presented here, but this is the basic of the categorical imperative as I understand it, at least.
Okay. Thank you for answering that question, because that was something I kind of knew what it was, but like, just to be safe, I want to hear that, because I'm just thinking about, I'm trying to read more Kant, and so if I can kind of get a gist of something about him before I dive deep into reading him, but I'm only reading him to understand Scruton and Hopper better. That's really it. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
and also all the anarchists on Twitter. But like I said, the beginning of the book, he does seem to kind of deal with the evolutionary biologist people who are trying to draw out a human nature through like a evolutionary biology or a evolutionary psychological lens, like Jonathan Haidt, Brett Weinstein, Richard Dawkins, these kind of people,
Mm-hmm.
the selfish gene. And all I could think of was the what's his name? Yuval Harris's, not Sam Harris, Yuval something Harris's book
Harari.
Sapiens.
Yeah,
Wow, yeah,
Yuval Noah Harari.
yeah.
I do have not read *Sapiens*. I have been gifted it,
Ooh.
so I have it here. And I'm kind of somewhat tempted to read it every now and then.
I want to cover it on a podcast because my atheist friend loves that book, so I know I'll hate it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it'd be kind of fun to have to go through it and prep for it and kind of maybe have a podcast debunking it, Well,
I have no idea
not
what even the
debunking it,
main
but
piece is. Yeah, I don't even know what the main
yeah, not
pieces are.
debunking, but from I think it was a BizCap, Billington Scotus. He read it once. I talked to him
Yeah,
about it. He kind of says it's a very materialistic and kind of nihilistic explanation of like, the functions of this led to the functions of this, led to the functions of this, led to this socialist, to this liberal hellscape.
yeah, it's a very. I think again, just you can read it together with Phaser's Last Superstition. I think if I did read it, I would read it together with Phaser or look up the relevant parts because most of it is dealt with in Phaser, I would suspect, and wouldn't require a more complex argument. Because I'm sure there are like smart materialist philosophers or whatever that would require a more complex Aristotelian argument to sort of evade and to debunk properly. But I don't suspect Noah Harari as a great intellect that I should contend with.
Same. I had a few quotes here from the book. I figure we're kind of just because again, the thing with this book is that it's when it comes to covering philosophy books, it's not like covering a political book where you kind of bring up ideas here and there. It's kind of like it's best to kind of just read the guy's when it comes to philosophy, just read his stuff and then comment on that. Then it is to kind of attempt to put it in your own words. So I'm just gonna read some quotes off and we'll kind of talk about those quotes. And then if you have any quotes you want to read off, you can read off and talk about those quotes. And we'll just kind of walk our way down the list of quotes here.
Okay.
I envision evolutionary psychologists offering the following account of laughter. By laughing together at our thoughts, they might say we have come to accept them, and that this makes cooperation with our imperfect neighbors easier, so that neutralizes anger at our shared inadequacies. Hence, a community of laughing people have a competitive advantage over a community of the humorless. Now, I didn't have this part to say, but he goes on later to say that this attempt to account for laughing requires only knowing what laughing is. Like it's simply is looking at how we laugh and applying how we do it to other animals. Other animals do not laugh.
It's a very hilarious attempt because it sort of presupposes, and he does this with Nietzsche too. He points out how Nietzsche does this in Genealogy of Morals too. It presupposes the very thing it's attempting to demonstrate why it came about. In its demonstration of its origin, it's presupposing the very thing exists. So, for example, you can ask, okay, how or why does it presuppose that laughter already exists? Well, in that passage, it's saying, the hypothetical evolutionary biologist is saying, well, laughter brings about good feelings and soothes animosity. It's like, okay, and therefore it's a trait. Therefore it's advantageous for a species to have it. Okay, then you're not really explaining what laughter is. You're just saying it's advantageous to have laughter.
Yeah.
To understand what laughter is, you have to understand what laughter is, not just say, okay, it came about for this. You're like, no, you can say, well, of course, species which can laugh, the human species, that is an evolutionary advantage. Okay, but that's almost a tautology under the evolutionary paradigm that everything which survives is either evolutionarily neutral or evolutionary advantageous, or if it is disadvantageous, it's offset by something else. So like someone who is handicapped is offset by the fact that he has a community of caretakers around him, and so altruism is a trait, an evolutionarily advantageous trait, which allows more people to pass off more genes, populate, increase the population, so on, so forth. Okay, but you're not really explaining what altruism is. You're just saying that it's evolutionarily good. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's all, again, that's basically a tautology here because the human species is alive. Therefore, most, if not all of its traits must be evolutionarily advantageous to some degree or to some time period. You're not really explaining what that trait is.
Yeah. Yeah, this kind of gets into the whole how a lot of modern sciences only really account for like material causes. I guess in these evolutionary biology ones, they kind of really only account for like functional causes, and they don't really explain things outside of what like I don't think I copied it, but he had the point where like if you try to explain the function, if you try evolutionary biologists would explain how what wings are on a bird by explaining that they need the wings, they need the wings to fly, and that's the function of them, and they wouldn't go any deeper than that. It's just like, well, what are wings? Well, they need them to fly. It's like, well, what is it? They need them to fly. It's like,
it's like, well, okay, but what does it do?
What does it do?
How does it work? You're not really explaining how it works, even just the basic material things. Imagine something like laughter, which requires intention towards other subjects, an object that maybe it requires derision. There's different kinds of laughter. There's a smirk. There's laughing at a tragedy. People laugh at funerals sometimes. There's laughter at like reminiscing of old times. There's so many different kinds of laughters, which require different explanations of why we call this laughter, why this one feature props up in so many different circumstances, where you can't just say, okay, it's evolutionary advantageous. Okay, but that doesn't really explain what it is or why it pops up in these circumstances. You just said, okay, you've basically just said it exists. That's basically what you've said. You've said laughter exists and it endured through the centuries. Because you've described maybe an additional characteristic of laughter, that it is evolutionarily advantageous. You haven't described laughter itself. You've described maybe an additional feature of it, if it even is evolutionarily advantageous. Maybe it's not. Yeah. Maybe the guy who made like silly jokes about everyone else was like killed early on, and like, but somehow they survived because they knew when to keep shut, and so passed their genes. I don't know. Like that could be the case, and maybe it was offset by the other gene of self-preservation and knowing when to shut up.
On a point about laughing, like acquired intentionality, this reminds me of his point later he brought up about Daniel Dennett and how his account of intentionality. Which reminded me again of Ed Fader's philosophy of the mind, how Daniel Dennett had the whole like it's homunculus, like all the way down. And I'm just like, I mean, I can't take the word homunculus serious as watching Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. I know it's like an actual thing people talk about, but the moment I hear homunculus, I'm like, where's lust? Where's greed? Where they at? It's but yeah, the again, the account of like mental states, intentionality, qualia. It seems like the evolutionary biologists like all implicitly kind of have a materialist framework of the mind. That they don't know if it's connected, but there definitely seems to be like an implicit understanding of how mental states don't really need that intentionality. Like we impart the way he described Bear Dillon described like intentionality is imparted on us through sayings, like the how does Screw put it that the AC controls have intentionality because they can be turned. They can turn it up or turn it down. They intend to turn things up or turn things down. So the intentionality is departed from the user to the object. Kind of reminds me of how Ayn Rand's teleology doesn't exist, except when we impart teleology to something that we create.
Mm-hmm. So, that's a very funny explanation of intentional states because it very obviously doesn't hold up. Like just to like prima facie, it's like that's obviously not what's going on. Like I'm sorry, that's obviously not what's going on unless you're claiming an AC controller is sentient.
Yeah.
Like that's obviously not what's going on in my head, nor is there any representation of a foreign object in the controller. It's just effective causation. By my press of a button, it does this or that. Yeah. That's it.
You made this great point in a group chat about Daniel Dennett that he's better than the rest of the new ACS. Their arguments fall apart on page 1. His fall apart on page 3.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, though.
This is a fantastic. Yeah, that was fantastic. I loved it.
It's true, though. He's the most philosophically educated of the new atheists, and he's still kind of a big retard.
Yeah,
Which
like,
is endlessly amusing to me.
There's a Richard Dawkins was like an evolutionary biologist. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist.
In
Possibly.
big heavy quotes there.
big quotes. Possible neuroscience.
Possibly.
Christopher Hitchens was just a what was he? A journalist?
A journalist, yeah.
Yeah, he was a publicist. That's all he was. He had great rhetoric skills. And then they actually did one actual philosopher in the bunch, and it's this retard.
It's this massive fucking retard, which is so funny to me.
Yeah, he's the one I know the least about, which is kind of because that speaks to how the new atheists are so unphilosophical. The one philosopher and the four new atheists is the least popular.
He's kind of the least interesting one, though. I understand why, because at least, like, I don't know, if you want to read about, like, basic biology, like, Dawkins is, like, a decent writer, and I guess The Greatest Show on Earth, which I read many years ago, is, like, a decent explanation of evolution, and it's kind of cool. And it has this really funny bit where he's like, by the way, we can totally breed a race of Ubermensch. Like, which is so funny because he's like, I'm not saying we should. I just want to correct scientific idiots who say we can't. Of course we can, you idiots. We can select for anything. And it's really funny when he goes like, I'm not saying it's good, but I am saying, however, that it is possible.
I know. He went to Dawkins one kind of tweet where he said, eugenicists are obviously bad, but to act like it's not something we can do is stupid.
Yeah, it's literally that tweet, but he goes on like a 2-page.
I love it.
And like, I kind of respect that because like he clearly sees us as a moral evil, but because he's a biologist and he has some commitment to the science of biology and its truth, he's like, no, I have to kind of say it's true, like that it is possible. So I respect that. I also respect where he's not afraid to say, I don't get Kafka. What is it about? And just make a fool of himself on the internet, which is really funny.
I loved it when he debated that Catholic priest, and he was like, if there was going to be a cause to the universe, it'd have to be absolutely simple. And everyone laughed. He's like, what's funny? And it's just like, you don't know what you're talking about. That was
really fun. It was in Australia too, which kind of surprised me. Even the audience was kind of laughing, which surprised me. I was like, wait, is this audience like filled with like well-catechized Catholics? What the fuck is going on?
They get it. It was a weird one. I watched that entire episode, debate. It was a very weird debate. It's the new atheist. So I would love to cover, once we kind of get more into like Thomistic metaphysics, we're kind of doing more Thomistic episodes. I want to do a 4-part series where we do one book from each of the new atheists. I think that'd be kind of a fun, like 4-part series, like this debunking, like we'll label it canceling the apocalypse, and we'll just go through each of the new atheist books and set them down. So that'd be kind of a fun little series.
That sounds good, but we should get back to the book. I do have one quote before that, and it's the opening paragraph of a science and subversion subchapter. So I'll just read this short paragraph. The concept of the meme belongs with other subversive concepts: Marx's ideology, Freud's unconscious, Foucault's discourse, in being aimed at discrediting common prejudice. It seeks to expose illusions and to explain away our dreams, but it is itself a dream, a piece of ideology accepted not for its truth, but for the illusory power that it confers on the one who conjures with it. It has produced some striking arguments, not least those given by Daniel Dennett in Breaking the Spell, but it possesses the very fault for which it purports to be a remedy. It is a spell with which the scientific mind seeks to conjure away the things that pose a threat to it. That's the quote I had lined up. I think it's a very well-written and interesting one. He then goes on to explain this on, he gets Dawkins as an example, and he sort of does the same point that Phaser does, where it's like Dawkins is using teleological language all over the place, like especially in Selfish Gene, and he's just assigning it to like genes instead of humans. And it's like, okay, but if genes are a part of human, then like humans clearly have teleology. And the teleology, or at least they have like secondhand teleology imparted by those genes, which is to spread genes and so on.
Yeah. No, it's definitely on the whole point about teleology. I have the quote here. In a cogent biological theory, all such teleological idioms must be replaced with functional explanations. And that's what the recourse to game theory and similar devices is supposed to authorize. The player wants to win adopts a winning strategy.
And that is a teleological explanation of the behavior because a player wants to win. You're like, okay, you haven't solved anything really with game theory.
Yeah. I don't know what it is about game theory, but every time it comes up, I'm just immediately disinterested. Like I don't know why. Yeah, the moment I saw someone brings up game theory, maybe because I can't stand like the people I see bring it up, I just can't stand. So I never heard anyone bring it up who wasn't a guy I already didn't like. But I'm sure I could find someone to come a game theory where I can actually care. But every time I hear, I'm kind of just like, why? Why do I care about this? I don't know why.
Game theory is cool when it's like applied to strategy, like military strategy or strategy for games, literally like like board games or like chess or something like that. It's also very useful when they're trying to describe like something like a thriller or a detective going after a bad guy. It's used to great effect, or so I've heard, in the Free Body Problem series, Remembrance of Earth's Past series, where it's a sort of a very hard sci-fi scientific fiction novel that depicts an alien invasion on Earth and what would have to happen, and also takes on the Fermi problem or a Fermi paradox of why we don't know alien life. So it sort of explores, okay, if very technologically aliens do try to invade Earth, and we have some warning of this, what can be done with inferior technology? What are the things that can stop the invasion? What can halt it? What cannot? What are the mind games that we can play? So on and so forth. And so that's interesting in that respect. But when someone tries to explain something else with it, it sort of kind of falls apart because game theory is a formalization of obvious behavior, which is just reacting to incentives. That's what game theory is. It's a formalization of behavior in certain scenarios where you call the scenario a game and assign rewards, fictional rewards, such as, this actor or the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner values telling the authorities versus not telling X amount, and values not telling Y amount. And so, but if you introduce this other consideration, then it's X plus 5 or Y minus 2, and then that might change the result based on the prisoner's disposition, which determines the original X and Y values. So it's just a formalization of stuff that we all intuitively know, but it's fun to talk about because it's fun to talk about incentivized behavior.
Yeah. I guess that makes more sense then. Because whenever I hear it come up, like I think because I heard it's like Brett Weinstein and Jonathan Haidt brought it up, and I'm just like, nope, I'm out. I don't know, like last tangent before we get back to like I have one more quote on like the biological side of things before we move on to the more philosophical side of things. But before we get to that, he references Jonathan Haidt in this book, and even when he brings someone bringing up Jonathan Haidt, I zoned out for the entire paragraph. Like it's like Jonathan Haidt zoned out, and I'm like, oh, I remember that I was listening to an audiobook. I don't know what it is, but that guy's name is I immediately just zone out. I'm like, I don't care. I don't know why, but he's just so like, his existence just bugs me.
I haven't read any Haidt, so I don't know. Can't tell you anything about him.
He's frustrating.
Anyway, back to the book. What else do you have in the first part? Because I have very little in the first part. We kind of already. You had laughter, which I had underlying. We talked about science and subversion. That is, it tries to subvert other common understandings of the world, which can't really be done away with. We talked about Verstehen, which I had outlined. We didn't use the word, but that is understanding. It's just a German word for understanding. That the phenomenologists, I think even Max Weber used it. I know Hoppe uses it actually in describing how economic actions have to take Verstehen, that is the understanding of intentions, and that therefore that economics is based on Verstehen, that is the understanding of intentional actions by rational agents, and so on. So Verstehen is a very interesting and familiar word to me. But we already talked about that in intentions, and how that's very much the intentionality. What we talk about intentionality belongs to, you have to undertake Verstehen to understand laughter. You have to perform a social to understand the social phenomenon that is laughter by trying to get into the minds of people, not just saying it's evolutionarily advantageous, because that's nothing.
Yeah. The last quote I have is kind of not even something I think I don't know if we might comment on a little bit, but not a whole lot. It's kind of just a summarizing quote from his chapter, and so I think it'd be a good way to kind of cap this off.
Mm-hmm.
In the hands of their popularizers, the biological sciences are used to reduce human condition to some similar archetype. On the assumption that what we are is what we once were, and that the truth about mankind is contained in our genealogy. The previous wave of pop genetics, what's called sociobiology, came up with all deliberately disturbing conclusions, such as 1. Morality has no other demonstrable ultimate purpose than to keep human genetic material intact. Such conclusions depend upon using the language of common sense, while at the same time canceling the presuppositions on which common sense terms depend for their meaning. This trick can be played in almost any area of human thinking and never more effective when it is used to pour scorn on our moral and religious ideals.
Yes, it is an excellent paragraph. It could almost come from a Christian. Well, he was an Anglican, although not a very believing one, but he was a member of the Church of England and wrote a book defending it, which is very funny to me. I am almost curious as to what it is.
I saw it on his website today, and I'm like, I keep forgetting he's an Anglican. You know, he just seems like a guy who's like kind of smart, but doesn't go all the way into something, you know, about religious stuff. But then you forget he was an Anglican, you know. So let's go. He's but yeah, I think it's a great quote, and it kind of reminds me of not the, you know, I'm not gonna bring it up. I'm not gonna make the comparison because I make that comparison a lot with this guy, so I'm actually not gonna make it. But
okay,
I would say the keep it. What did I hear? Such conclusions depend upon using the language of common sense, while at the same time canceling the presupposition that what common sense terms depend for their meaning. I like that point specifically. I think that's a very great point. It reminds me of what's that guy's book? I think it's Donald Hoffman. I may have that wrong. It's a guy who wrote the Case Against Reality book where he said he did a bunch of
Donald
math.
Hoffman. Yes, you talked about him a few times.
Yeah, it reminds me of this guy where he's just like, well, listen, I did the math, and like, doesn't it make sense that evolutionarily speaking, your brain wouldn't show you things? And it's like, I guess so. Therefore, the brain might not show you at all any of reality. It's like you made a very common sense argument for denying that we have common sense and common sense perception.
Yeah, like, you're presupposing reality to cancel out reality, which is very funny. That is like, because it's so obvious, right? Because you can at least like you can sort of buy the idea that, you know, we can know nothing but our minds. Because prima facie, you're like, you can kind of look at it in abstract and say, okay, I guess I can understand where you're coming from, because, you know, you have immediate access to yourself because you are yourself, but I don't have immediate access to everything else. That is mediated. So I can't really know them in themselves. I can only know myself, I guess. Context is even further, but you can't really know the noumenal self. You can only know the phenomenal self, the phenomenal, whatever. Yeah. But you can't even make a distinction there, which is interesting because the mind is also kind of a transcendental object to Kant, which you can't really know in itself, but you can sort of know its phenomena. So that's interesting. But you can sort of buy that. But when the guy is literally like, say, we did this brain scan and therefore you can't know reality. It's like, motherfucker, you did a brain scan. You used a machine for that. That was You're interacting with the material world.
Mindcast point is like, you did a bunch of math to tell you can't trust mass.
Yeah.
It's such the popularity of that book. This kind of demonstrated to me how unphilosophically minded the chief intellectuals of our time are.
Yeah, it's very
like Lex Friedman and Sam Harris both did like 3-hour-long interviews with this guy, and I'm like, if either one of you kind of saw it for a minute about where he quotation marks proves this theory, you understand that if it was true, he would disprove the means of proving it.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's such a nonsensical thing. I have a friend who loves that book and fully believes it. And I'm like, why? How?
You have really strange friends, Caleb.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's Central Florida, dude. You know,
okay, that makes sense. You're excused.
It's a weird place, you know. I'm strange. I'm strange here. Everyone's strange. Before we go into kind of more philosophical, he kind of gets into more of an ethical and more. He kind of focuses for the first time of the book. Kind of talks about the going against the biologists and the kind of the materialist or genetic explanations of human nature. Before he goes into like the philosophical and moral side of human nature, and he seems to base a lot of his way of framing the conversation and going forward is in the IU relation.
Yes.
And so if you could explain the IU relation, I think that would be useful before we go forward and talking about the rest of the book.
Just before that, I'll kind of summarize the first chapter, Humankind. If a very concluding, we've kind of talked about it indirectly, and we've kind of already summarized it just with our conversation. But the main idea is that whatever it is, whether it's immaterial, perhaps it certainly is immaterial, but the mind and the relation of what a human is, the human person belongs to the kind of persons that is taking into account its rationality, not merely its animal aspect. And maybe he sort of gives the argument that perhaps this is emergent out of the material biological aspect that so conditions the animal so that an immaterial rational aspect emerges out of it. He gives the analogy of a painting, so that a painting really is just lines and blobs of different pigments of paint. But if someone is painted there, you see a face. But you can just say, well, it's just lines and blobs of painting. And if you repeat this exact same line and blob in another canvas, you'll end up with the same face. And if you're not seeing the face, you're looking at the painting wrong. It's just obvious that it's there, but it's also not the lines and blobs, even if it is composed of that. It's a face. It's smiling, or it's sad, or it's crying. It has an expression. So it emerges out of the material aspect of the paint on the canvas. And he sort of says that at the very least, we have to say that consciousness, self-consciousness, that the mind is at the very least emergent out of the paint and canvas that is the human body, at the very least. And he sort of goes through different biological explanation and sort of, says that they're not enough. They don't capture enough of what is a human. Human is a person. If angels exist, we would belong to the same kind as angels, even if not biological type.
That painting analogy reminds me of have you ever heard of mereological nihilism?
No, I have not.
So mereological nihilism is the idea that since nothing can be created or destroyed, everything that exists now, like this table, is not really a table. It's just a bunch of the parts from the beginning from the beginning of the universe to now. All these parts exist, and things don't really undergo changes. They only conceptually undergo changes. So the existence of this table existed at the beginning of time. We didn't conceptually call it a table until we put it together and labeled it a table. And so it's an arbitrary labeling of things. So there is nothing new, really. It's kind of everything is, and we conceptualize different names for things.
Isn't that just nominalism taken into an extreme?
Yes, that's kind of what.
Taken in together with what is it? I forget which law of physics it is, but the idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed.
Yeah,
pretty much. So it's just different arrangements of energy to which we give different names. But then they can't say the table existed, because that would assume like something of a table exists. But if the table is just an arbitrary name that we give to an arbitrary formation, then the table doesn't exist. It didn't exist, and it doesn't even really exist now. It's just a name in our minds, if our minds even exist.
Yeah, it was. I heard it because it was brought up as an objection to the Kalam cosmological argument, and so it was just kind of a.
That sounds silly.
Mind. It was kind of because William the Quick was like, well, you can believe that, but doesn't disprove that everything started to come into existence.
Yeah, that is funny.
It was a good comment. It was a pretty good, interesting. It was an interesting conversation. But now we're gonna move into the philosophy. You have any more comments on the genetic side before we move into the philosophy side?
No, I do not. We can move on to chapter 2.
Okay, chapter 2. This might be split into a 2-part episode because we're already running up on 40 minutes and we're on chapter 2.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 2 of like 3 or 4 though, so
yeah,
we're doing decent.
They're pretty good. So I really don't have a whole lot of quotes in chapter 2 besides
I have a few.
Yeah, go ahead and go with some.
No. You asked me to explain the IU relation. I'll do that.
Yeah, do that.
We'll read maybe 1.5, maybe 2 paragraphs before, which are the beginning paragraphs of chapter 2. Ever since Kant, it has been clear that I thoughts, that is, I, the letter in quotation marks, thoughts, are fundamental to the life of the person, committing us to the belief in freedom and to the appeal to reason. Just as fundamental, Stephen Darwell has argued, are you thoughts, thoughts about the person to whom I am accountable or to whom my reasons are addressed. The moral life depends on something that Darwell calls the second person standpoint, the standpoint of someone whose reasons and conduct are essentially addressed to others. In this chapter, I wish to develop this idea. When I give another person a reason for action, I am assuming that I have the standing, the authority, and the competence to do this. And I also confer standing, authority, and competence on the other. It is not that I draw the other's attention to some reason that exists independently in the nature of things. The moral dialogue is one in which I give reasons to you, and these reasons have weight for you precisely because that is what I am doing. Suppose you were standing on my foot. There is a reason for you to remove your foot from mine, namely that this will relieve me from the pain. But there is a reason that I can also give to you that is quite another authority, namely that I don't want you to stand on my foot. This reason is addressed from me to you, and its force depends upon the shared assumption that you are accountable to me for your voluntary actions insofar as they affect me. You can actually see quite a lot of Hoppe in this.
Mhm.
Hoppe draws, in fact, his entire argument of the argumentation ethics depends on the IU encounter. Because if the IU encounter doesn't really happen, argumentation ethics doesn't take place. As he says, like if you're on an island and you want a banana and there's a gorilla on the island and the gorilla also wants the same banana, the gorilla is a technical problem, either to be avoided, killed with a firearm, or run away from. It's not really another person in the sense that a person is rational. What's Boethius' definition? An individual substance of a rational nature. That's not really a person. It can't give you reasons. You can't give it reasons. You can just sort of interact with it. It is, as Hoppe put it, a technical problem. Animals are, for the most part, technical problems. Of course, because we are in an IU relationship with other people, and because we inhabit a moral world, our treatment of animals also, forms habits, forms certain ideas of thought, and so treatment of animals kind of does become a moral problem, even if there's nothing we specifically owe to animals as a person, but we sort of owe to animals as sort of a responsibility of the environment, just as destroying a forest for no reason is obviously prima facie blameworthy. Destroying an animal for no reason is also prima facie blameworthy. But the IU encounter is basically this. I am self-conscious. I know that I think that I think, I believe that I think. I can give reasons for my actions. Then I encounter a you. A you is another I, is an I who also has self-consciousness, but I am not that I. That I is other to me. So when an you encounter happens, you recognize the self-consciousness of the other person. The other person recognizes self-consciousness in you, and so you are no longer technical problems, but moral problems. That is, you have reasons to give to each other for your behavior. You are held responsible to each other. You can't really be held responsible to a horse if you mistreat him. You don't really have a responsibility to the horse. You might have a responsibility to the common society you live in, because the common society does not like mistreatment of animals. But then again, that goes back to an IU encounter. So what Scruton is trying to say is that sort of all morality sort of boils down to an IU encounter. I would extend this argument further that all morality does in fact come down to an IU encounter, even when you're alone, because there is still the IU encounter of God. Because
That's
God
what I
is
was going to say. I was going to go that direction. That's not as if I was listening to I was reading it and I was explaining it, and I'm like, it just seems to me like a lot of people say that morality is only like an extroverted saying, where like morality doesn't exist when you're by yourself. Like integrity is not really a saying. Morality is just an external saying. But if you apply the IU encounter to you and God, because God's person, but then you can use the IU encounter to kind of stretch out kind of a good foundation for saying. So actually, I really don't have any issue with the IU encounter.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a pretty good foundation and pretty easy. It's like it's not it's I'm sure it can get more complex if people try to push back against it, but like common conversation, I imagine using that as an easy starting point to talk to somebody would be pretty simple. You know,
because if we're being scholastic about it, morality really boils down to natural law and teleology, and final causality, being what you are. But then you can very easily make the argument that the IU encounter and the fulfillment of certain things in the IU encounter is very much part of our teleology. Part of a rational essence is the IU encounter with the other and being held accountable and being responsible for certain other things instead of being something that emanates from pure reason as a Kantian would have it. It's not something you can say it's a part of intrinsically what we are because of our nature as human beings, created by God and so forth, to have this encounter not only with other people, but with God. And so our final causality is to sort of really enter into a proper IU encounter with God in heaven. That's sort of, I mean, you can take Phase's argument that our life is really about the next one and sort of reframe it in terms of the IU encounter. So I don't think the IU encounter is invalid. It can sort of lead you astray at times, I think, morally, if you think purely in terms of it. But if you think phenomenologically as what is happening in this situation when I am being held to account, what am I thinking, what is actually happening between these two persons when there is a moral wrong done, it's, I think, a very good tool for descriptive purposes as to what is happening. As to what actual morality consists of, I would say that it consists of, fulfilling your teleology and obeying the natural law.
Yeah.
But a phenomenologist could make the argument that, all moral actions do actually, could descriptively at least, consist of an IU encounter, either of God or of other people.
Well, I have a quote now. I think I'll read from the kind of involves the IU encounter, and I'm in a more section here. Make sure I find the right one. Yeah, here it is. Several writers have drawn attention to the objectification. God, I can't read tonight. To the objectification of the other and of women in particular, and the use of pornographic images. There is truth in the complaints which have their roots in the Kantian intuition that that have animated our secular worldview since the Enlightenment. But I think that the complaints do not get to the heart of the matter. The real evil of porn lies not in its portrayal of other people as sexual objects, but in the radical decentering that is its effect on.
That it affects in the sexual feelings of the observer. I have the quote here.
Thank you. Sorry. For some reason on my copy and paste of it, like it wasn't. I copied and pasted from the ebook, and so it kind of cut it up, and so I didn't copy it evenly. Let me just space that out so it kind of makes it easier to read. Here it is. The real evil porn lies not in the portrayal of other people as sexual objects, but in the radical decentering that it affects in the sexual feelings of the observer. It prizes sexual excitement free from the IU relation and directs to a nameless sense of mutual arousal. And what's arousal too is depersonalized, as though it was a physical condition and not an expression of the self. This decentering of arousal and desire makes them into things that happen to me, occurring under the harsh light of voyeuristic torts, instead of being part of what I am to you and you are to me in the moment of intimacy. I think it's correct. I think it's a great way of again a very nice description of the way some of the problems with pornography. It's a very beautiful description.
And you can sort of see how the IU encounter actually meshes really well with teleology, because if part of the teleology of sex is not only the production of children, but is also in fact what would be a sharing of an intimate moment, a growing closer of two people, pair bonding in the lingo of evolutionary biology, then this pair bonding does consist in an IU encounter of two people and a reflection of mutual arousal, which leads to other things. And then finally, the final causality of that is in the production of children. But you can sort of see how this already, the fact that it doesn't even fulfill the basic requirements of the IU encounter means that it cannot fulfill the requirements of the production of children and the rearing of children. So maybe you can produce children if you rape someone, but you certainly aren't rearing them or taking care of them or raising them if you just rape someone and leave. That's not happening.
Yeah, no, it's definitely I'm the more I think about it, and the more I read and stuff when it kind of uses the IU relation, the more I'm kind of like I appreciate the how do I put this? It is a easy way to begin a conversation with someone about morality. It does not require using language or something that kind of gets them to see it in a religious framework. I mean, at least when I talk to atheists, if I try to speak up anything on moral issue, they immediately kind of assume it's a religious thing. But I see like you can use the IU relation from even as an atheist or a secular standpoint to kind of make the same point. And you can even it can be a good lead into other to a better description of natural law morality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's something I'm going to try to definitely incorporate more into my conversations I have with atheists nowadays. I think it's a very good point.
I think Scruton's description of the IU encounter is a very good intro to what phenomenology really kind of is supposed to do. Because you can only really go so far with it, and unless you're like a poet, basically like Heidegger, you sort of find its limits fairly quickly. If you're someone like St. Edith Stein, you get to Thomism for phenomenology. In fact, she was, very adamant that you could get from phenomenology to arrive at all the ideas of St. Thomas, and from St. Thomas get to phenomenology. She was very adamant that you could go both ways, and you would arrive at the other.
Did he write that? Is that in the books he wrote, or was that?
I think Finite and Eternal Being does that. Act and Potency, Finite and Eternal Being, and there's like a third one. She wrote a trilogy towards the end of her life, mainly focusing on these two. She also has a book called St. Thomas and Heidegger, or something like that, where she's really comparing both of the thoughts of her teacher Heidegger and St. Thomas, her, let's say, how do I put this? Her posthumous teacher. So it's I haven't read that one. I've read like 50 pages of Finite and Eternal Being, which is so far mostly her ranting about the fact that she can't write in Latin and be understood, even though she can speak Latin. That's most of what I remember. She has a very interesting, like on page 1 and 2, she solves problems of act and potency, which I'm sure were already solved by St. Thomas, but she put it in a way that I didn't realize could already be done. Such as act and potency relating to God, that if God hasn't already done this, then how can that be? Then how can we say that's potency because that's pure act? And so she sort of does a linguistic analysis that kind of solves problems of act and potency relating to God. She's a very interesting thinker, but I would not recommend that starting off because that's a very heavy, dense, like 600-page philosophy book. Read something more spiritual from her. Read her spiritual writings or The Science of the Cross, which is her book on St. John of the Cross. It's her biography and her explanation of his philosophy, basically.
No, that's a book that's been on my list for quite a while now.
Science of the Cross?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have it on Kindle, I think.
It's on my list. I'm finally knocking off a few books that have been on my list for a while, like this one, for example. And so once I probably get once my list is half empty, I can then fill it back up again. And so that'll definitely be one of the books I pick up soon. But we probably have time for one more quote. Do you have one you want to use? Or you want to go with one?
We can go with intentionality of pleasure, or we can talk about the first person case. That is how he makes the argument that selves sort of arise from a community of other people.
Let's go with that one.
Sure. So there's two arguments. There's Hegel's argument of recognition and Wittgenstein's first person case. I'll read both because they're one paragraph each. So first we have Wittgenstein's argument, the first person case, which he calls the argument from language. The argument from language tells us that first person declarations exhibit a special kind of privilege. If I am in pain, then I don't have to find out that I am in pain, and I know that I am in pain on no basis. Not to use the words I am in pain in this way is to misunderstand their meaning. In particular, it is to misunderstand the word I. This word gets its sense from the rule that truthfulness and truth coincide. A speaker who does not obey this rule would be using the term I to mean he or she. The speaker would show that he or she had not grasped the grammar of the first-person case. First-person awareness arises with the mastery of a public language, and therefore with the recognition that others are using the word I, as I do, in order to express what they think and feel directly. So this is the private language argument, basically. This is a very truncated form of the private language argument, which is essentially the idea that it BTFO solipsism. Secondly, it's sort of the idea that first, you can't, every sort of thought is kind of must be publicly accessible to some degree, because you can't really reach your innermost thoughts. So I don't know. So, someone says a solipsist can begin with, I don't know what you mean when you say sad, because I'm not in your mind. So I don't know the experience of sad that you are describing. I only know intimately my own experience of sadness. And yet, we all seem to, and yet you, the solipsist who begins this argument, but you can then go on to say, therefore, I don't really know what goes on in your mind. Maybe nothing goes on in your mind. Maybe you're a flesh puppet, a meat computer. But that argument falls apart, because where did this motherfucker get the notion of I am sad? Well, he got it from other people teaching him what it means, when it means, and he sort of gets it from observing other people, because maybe he as a child said, I am sad, because he misunderstood the word sad to mean happy, and then his parents corrected him. So Wittgenstein first develops the thought that no language can be private, because no language, every language, in principle at least, can be used by a community of language speakers to describe their thoughts and feelings. It can never be so that only I understand this language because only I have these thoughts and feelings. That can never happen. His argument is more subtle than I remember, but it's an interesting argument worth checking out.
Yeah.
And so this idea of I really only arises in a community of other people who can say I. That is, the idea of I only arises in an I-you encounter with other rational beings. Or else you're living in a world of perceptions such as hungry, eat food, not hungry, hunting, so on, so forth. You live in a world of pure perception and action, instinct and urge, unless you encounter the I. Now, we can maybe dispute this, but it's at least an interesting argument that he presents. Hegel's argument is similar, though presented in a very different idiom. In this state of nature, motivated only by my desires and needs, I am conscious, but without the sense of self. Through the encounter with the other, which begins in a life and death struggle for survival, I am forced to recognize that I, too, am other to the one who is other to me. Hegel spells out, in Poetic Steps, the gradual emergence from this encounter of the moment of mutual recognition in which one comes to know oneself as a free self-consciousness, by recognizing the free self-consciousness that stands over and against one. Self and other come into consciousness in a single act of recognition, which bestows on me the ability to know myself in the first person at the same time as demanding that I recognize the first person being of you. So this is very poetic, but it's essentially making the argument that I can't really know I'm self-conscious. I can only know I'm conscious unless I encounter another person who is self-conscious, because if you're alone in a dark room and there's no wind, there's no nothing, you're floating in space, you can't really feel anything on your body. And let's say that you can't really feel the inner workings of your body. How do you know you have a body and aren't just like a mind floating in a dark room? Because there's no interaction with your body. You need someone or something outside, like a breeze or whatever, to come in and touch your body, your skin, to say, oh, I have skin in this, and that place. To know those things. You don't instinctively know them. You have them, but you don't really know it until you encounter something else which interacts with it in a specific way to trigger a reaction. And the way we know our self-consciousness, according to Hegel, is in the I-you encounter. I'm not completely sure I buy this, but I think it's a somewhat plausible description of how proper self-consciousness arises, that is, self-consciousness as a rational agent in a community of irrational agents. I'm not sure I would agree with the first steps, but or at least tentatively, I'm not sure I would agree to all of it, but it's an interesting argument. I find Wittgenstein's more plausible, his public language, private language, but Hegel's is more poetic and interesting in this encounter of both that forces a mutual recognition. He's certainly right that an encounter with the other that you realize has self-consciousness does force you to recognize that the other has self-consciousness, and you can't really take that back. Even someone who calls himself a solipsist won't behave as a psychopath, even if he says it's only because he's afraid of going to jail or whatever.
2 points. One, yeah, I agree. The Wittgenstein one definitely is much more interesting and much more. It seems much more on his face plausible.
It's much more analytical and less poetic. Yeah. Yes.
And I gotta say, I'm a. What was it? I posted a poll maybe a while ago, and I asked, "What is the beginning of philosophy?" It was one of my options I put was is language the beginning of philosophy? And people had to always answer and stuff, but I always do like the people who make arguments based kind of on like the IU relation or on or secret language or what was it? You had one. He was I think it was Peter Geets. You made an article on that one. It was on whenever you use the words good or bad, you are implicitly saying this thing's about good and bad.
Yeah, you're implicitly sort of holding it to a standard that is kind of teleological.
Yeah.
At the very least functional. There's no way to assess logically. There's no way to assess if something is good or bad without relating it to some specific function at the very least. And that sort of implies an inherent teleology of things, just logically speaking.
Yeah. Now, I'm a big fan of those kind of language-based.
Yeah, you'll like Wittgenstein then. And his books aren't big. Yes, 2 famous books. You don't need to read the first. You only the 2 books that are recommended, and they're very short, are what's the first one? The Philosophical Investigations, written towards the end of his life, and then his other book that's mostly just notes he had, which he had when he was reading St. Cardinal John Newman, mostly, because St. Cardinal John Newman is also very much a linguistic analyst and an analyst of grammar. So he's very much that sort of philosopher. And by the way, at that time, he was not a saint. He was just someone who was very famous in philosophy. And so Wittgenstein was reading him, and he was talking to a local Catholic priest about it. And so he wrote On Certainty, which is sort of his final work. It's very short, from what I remember. I haven't read it, but it is apparently very, very good. And there's an interesting. I've watched some lectures on it. There's some interesting arguments about justification of religious belief that I think we can take, such as that religious beliefs are hinge beliefs. That to doubt, for example, he doesn't make this argument, but I could use what he's writing on certainty to make the argument that to doubt that pure actus purus exists, that is pure act exists, is to very much doubt the very legibility of a rational investigation. So you can't really have a properly rational investigation into anything if actus purus doesn't exist, because then nothing really exists, because nothing is grounded in something. Because everything must be grounded in something, and if actus purus doesn't exist, then nothing really exists, and you don't exist. And so you're sort of missing the point of a rational investigation, which sort of has to take certain things as given. These are hinge beliefs. Therefore, it's sort of, it's silly to investigate whether you have 2 hands, unless you lost one in the war and you're, hallucinating or whatever. Mm-hmm. But for most people, it's silly. It's of course I have 2 hands. This is a hinge belief. I just have to take this for granted, because if I don't take for granted, no rational investigation into anything can exist or can even begin. And Wittgenstein makes the argument that, he wouldn't apply this to actus purus, I think, but he does apply it to certain religious beliefs. And he does say that, we shouldn't be sad over this. It's just that, we now understand what rational investigation is. So get on with things that can be rationally investigated and stop moping over the fact that some things can't.
Yeah, I'm definitely got to read into those, because it definitely seemed to kind of right up my alley of things I'm interested in. Second, on the point of solipsism, and you said even the most deranged solipsist won't, act like a crazy person, even if they claim it's for fear of jail. It reminds me of I probably mentioned it before on the podcast, but I'll bring it up again because new listeners might hear it. Zig Chesterton, I think in his book Heretics. No, it was in his book on St. Thomas Aquinas. He recounted about as a professor somewhere in England who wrote an article of a newspaper saying, why aren't more philosophers and academics solipsists? It says a rational, logical position that we said all this kind of accepted we are all to be solipsists. And Chesterton wrote him a letter saying, my good sir, if you are a solipsist, you are aware you are the only philosopher alive right now. You're the only philosopher that exists right now. Which is just, I love when someone has like a very clever kind of it's like I'm not engaging you, I'm agreeing with you, and by agreeing with you, you're still wrong.
And by
You know,
agreeing with you, I'm showing you're wrong.
yes, I love
really
those
do
things.
like Chesterton.
Yeah.
He sort of makes everyone look silly, which
Yes.
is he sort of shows how insane everyone is, really is, and he's great for that.
Oh yeah. Well, we've gone for an hour and a half. Let's wrap this up. Bodes, final thoughts on the book, some final thoughts on Scruton, and then go ahead and give your plugs.
So, final thoughts, at least on the book thus far. We'll probably record a part 2, right? Or am I mistaken?
Probably. Yeah, probably.
Okay. So, final thoughts on the book thus far. There's very interesting arguments here. He raises a lot of good points. In my opinion, he doesn't go far enough into what we would regard as a more Aristotelian conception of the human. But he does raise very good objections from even a more contemporary standpoint on the purely materialistic biological explanation of people, because that is, again, prima facie not what's going on. And so that's interesting to me. So those are my thoughts on the book. What else? I guess plugs. I'm Bulgakov's Behemoth on Twitter, exactly as you see written here. I have finally finished my article on marriage and hyperreality. It'll eventually go up when Astrotomism is back up. I may add a few flourishes to it and add a chapter discussing a certain song by a certain artist known as Jamiroquai to the end, which I think is highly entertaining, at least to myself. I hope readers will find it interesting at the very least. But yeah, that's about all from me.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming on, man. Happy to have you on as always. Everyone likes to like, comment, listen, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you enjoyed the Scruton book, let me know. We're gonna finish this book with a part 2, and if it gets good reception and we both enjoy it, we decide to cover more Scruton. I would love to cover Soul of the Word with Grant, because I think you'll like that. I know we have on the books you, Has, and Grant for I Drink Before I Am, and we're all going to do some wine drinking on that one, so that would be a lot of fun. I definitely want to get. I think Scruton's like a really good contemporary philosopher who needs to be. And I think, how to put this, he's not. He's a guy you can read that we can then agree with him and then kind of build off of him to make more optimistic Aristotelian points, kind of like we did today. And so I think he's a kind of a good guy to cover, because then we can cover something that's outside our circles and have a good conversation, rather than when you read like say we try to cover Ed Fazer's metaphysics, we're just going to be reading it and then going yep.
Yeah, we're just going to explain and summarize the argument, basically.
Yeah, but here we actually get to engage it more. I think that makes it more of a fun episode to record. So I want to cover more Scruton going forward. But if the audience doesn't like it, then they're stupid, because the audience is dumb.
Of course, always.
The audience is always dumb. Settler's Lament is right. The audience is dumb, and it's never his fault for being late.
True. So true, Settler.
Yes,
fellow Catholic, fellow Canadian Canuck Catholic.
That guy, I love that guy. He was on once, and it was an absolute blast.
I should watch that stream.
I said, so you're kind of part of the neo-reactionary space. I've never used that term because this seems kind of autistic. And I'm just I love this guy. He's great. But anyway, like, comment, share, subscribe. A lot of great stuff coming out. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.